Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Today we're talking Trojan Horse Affair. Podcast reignites questions about the place of religion in English and Welsh schools. It's following an article written in The Conversation by Céline Benoit, and Céline Benoit is here, and so is Parveen Akhtar. You're both new to the channel. Céline, start with you with a little bit of an introduction if you can.
Yes, hi, thanks for having me. So my name is Céline Benoit and I'm Senior Teaching Fellow in Sociology. I'm also Associate Dean for Public Engagement, and my work looks at childhood, religion and schools. So I'm looking especially at what young children have got to say about religion in primary education.
Lovely. And Parveen?
Hi, yeah, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Parveen Akhtar. I'm Senior Lecturer in Politics, History and International Relations here. I'm also the Deputy Head of Department. My work looks at political participation and young people more broadly, but also with a focus on political activism amongst Muslims in the UK.
Perfect. Well, Céline, we'll start with you. You've written this. It was a recent podcast series on the 2013-14 Trojan Horse Affair, which was an alleged but unproven plot to implement a strict Islamic ethos in some schools in Birmingham. It's drawn attention to the place that religion occupies in state-funded education in England and Wales. Just to begin with, can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to go into what the podcast is saying and looking into the controversy. I think that the podcast does quite an a good job there. It's more about trying to take the opportunity to reflect on religion in education. And I think one of the things that came out in the Trojan Horse Affair was that the schools were not following the legislation because they had a strong Islamic ethos, for example. And it was very much saying that there shouldn't be any religion because these are state-funded schools. And actually, what I'm saying is that it's not that clear-cut when you're looking at schools in England and in Wales. State-funded schools, they do have religion. They have compulsory religious education classes. So of course they're teaching about different religions, but they also have compulsory collective worship. So often in assemblies, you have what we call the the act of collective worship, which means that you have people who will gather together and they might be saying a school prayer, or they may be saying singing hymns and so on. And we haven't seen any controversy when this is Christian, because the legislation says that it's got to be broadly Christian. But schools are entitled to actually say that this is inappropriate for their schools if the population is predominantly non-Christian. And so what we've seen is that some schools have gotten the determination, so the exemption from following a Christian act of collective worship, and they've done, other types of collective worship. And so it was kind of a bit false when they were saying that these schools should have been secular, that these schools shouldn't have had any religion, because religion exists in every school in England and in Wales, really. So it was a bit too simplistic to say, there's an issue with the Islamic ethos of the school because there shouldn't be any religion in the schools because these are state-funded schools.
Parveen, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, Céline. There is a legislative directive to have a Christian ethos in schools in England and Wales. Many schools don't bother. Many schools opt out. And there is also the possibility of having a different religious ethos. And as you say, many Muslims, schools with Muslim majority populations have opted to hone in on this Islamic ethos. So to say that we had this alien religious ethos in English and Welsh schools when they should be secular is indeed, as Céline says, a false dichotomy there.
Céline, you mentioned in the article that your research shows that RE teaching can be problematic. Is that's not just down to things at a government level though?
No, it's not. And actually, religious education classes, they tend to follow a locally agreed syllabus. So that would be here in particular, that would be the syllabus of Birmingham. But, every school follows their locally agreed syllabus. And what my research is showing is that when we're talking about religion in education, often the focus is on either faith schools, and we have a big debate about whether we should have state-funded schools that are religious. So we've got quite a few Catholic and Church of England schools, for example. Or then the debate goes on to the act of collective worship that I've just mentioned, saying that maybe it's out of place to have acts of collective worship in education because, again, we go back to this liberal argument that in the state field we shouldn't have any religion. But what we tend to neglect is actually that we have religious education, which is compulsory in every type of schools in England and Wales. And the purpose is to learn about different religious traditions. So it's not what we used to have, back in the 60s, where it was very much Bible studies or something like that. So it's about learning about different religions and what we've called world religions, although there are issues around that as well. And what my research is showing is that maybe we should try and pay attention to what's going on in religious education classes. And it's not because those classes are looking at different religious traditions that there are no issues going on there. And so what I'm suggesting in my research is that we tend to focus mostly on Christianity because this is what the legislation is saying, and because this is how it's portrayed as being important to the country and so on. But it's also about how the other religions, non-Christian religions, are being represented, and there's this sense of other, really, where you feel like you're constantly learning about some kind of idealized other that doesn't really exist. And interestingly enough, this morning only, I was talking about this paper with a student of mine, and she was saying that she really recognized herself in there because she's a Muslim, and when she was studying Islam in schools, she never really felt like she was studying about her own tradition, and her lived experiences never really matched what she was learning. And she was saying it's a bit of a shame that we've got these discrepancies where we have kind of the elitist discourse about what religion should be and what actually they are like when they're being lived. And in schools, we tend to not pay enough attention to how religions are being lived by people and communities out there.
Parveen, do you think religion still has a place in sort of 2022 as part of a curriculum for England and Wales?
Certainly the state seems to think so, because we still have this religious directive in schools. I think what I would say is that there's certainly a role, as Céline says, for religion in schools, but also critical thinking too. Because if we go back to the article and the reignition of the Trojan Horse Affair, one of the key things which came out of there was just this accepted narrative within media and policy discourses of this Islamist plot to take over schools, and it was just accepted, right? It was accepted. There was policy changes at government levels which were instigated because of the acceptance of this plot, and actually if we really look down, take away all the different layers, what was the actual allegation? The allegation was that there's an Islamist plot to take over schools in Birmingham. That was not proved. It was actually dismissed. Now, what we did find was that there were instances of individual teachers in these schools in Birmingham who there was whistleblowing which suggested and actually proved that there was homophobic slurs. There was the teaching of creationism. There was misogynistic teachings, in particular around girls and what they should and shouldn't accept from their husbands. But these were individuals. This wasn't, there's two very different levels of categorization here. This wasn't a Muslim Islamist plot, the fifth column within. This was individual teachers who should very definitely be disciplined. They should be looked at, but it's not, this Islamist plot takeover, and that was proved to be the case. And actually, there was the academic reports on this issue by Therese O'Toole and John Holmwood. They suggested that there was a false narrative perpetuated And this narrative actually was perpetuated within the media, within policy discourses, and it led to serious miscarriages of justice against many of the teachers involved here. And they very clear about this.
Céline, is it a Birmingham thing? Because we seem to have this thing happen where something almost seems to get blown out of proportion or isn't true at all. I mean, you think of Winterval as an example of something where you just think this is absolutely crazy. But, the narrative is set and it's what people remember. Through this whole, I think you'd probably call it a fiasco, do you think the right learnings have been made post the Trojan Horse Affair?
I'd like to say so, but I don't think so. I think what we've seen is, and this is what Parveen is saying, is it was very much a racialized issue, and we if you just look at what happened, for example, was it last week or a couple of weeks ago? We know that some Catholic churches, some Catholic schools were about to welcome an author into the schools. And the church said that they couldn't do that because the author happens to be gay. Now, we know that there's been controversy around this, but what we didn't see happen is national legislation being put into place, securitization agenda being put into place in schools and so on. And this is what we've seen when we were talking about Islam in schools. We responded with national measures and so on. And you're asking me whether this is something that is quite typical of Birmingham. And I would say, I don't think it's typical of Birmingham, but what's typical of Birmingham is that narrative around Birmingham being a super diverse city and possibly a hotbed for radicalization and a city that needs to be surveilled, and where the security agenda does apply a lot more because we've got all these young people, and of course all these young people are more likely to be radicalized apparently because we are so much more diverse.
Parveen, do you think it's just one of those things that fills column inches in right-wing newspapers and sells newspapers? I think was it Fox News a couple of years ago that said there were places in Birmingham that were no-go areas because they were run by Muslims and people would avoid those areas, and that was obviously completely untrue. But it's something that feeds the red meat.
I think it's also a numbers game, right? So if you look at the numbers of Muslims in Birmingham, so the data from the last census, which we have number crunch, so in 2011, the 21% of Birmingham's population was Muslims, and then a survey in 2018 showed that actually that Muslim population had gone up from 21% in 2011 to 28% by the time we get to 2018. Now, the number of Muslims in Birmingham is a significant proportion. So it's a quarter of the population of the second largest city in the UK. They're also a very young population. So if you look at schools, a significant number of schools in Birmingham have a Muslim majority population. So this really, I think this really startles people. So when there was a number of news articles around 2011 when the census data was released. The last census data was released saying, there'll be these cities which will become Muslim majority cities by 2040, 2050. So it's something that the demographics certainly are sensationalized, and it does fill column inches.
Céline, where do we go from here? There will be a segment of society and people in England and Wales that will say, what's the point in teaching it? It's outdated. There's no science to it. It's all made up. It's make-believe. It has no place in a curriculum. But you could leave it down to choice at a certain level of education where if you want to go and learn about this, then you can go and do that. Should it be compulsory going forward?
I don't think we'll ever have consensus. When you talk about religion in education, I don't think this is something that we'll ever achieve. And in a way, you know what, it's fine. These conversations are helping us move on as well. We don't want to be in a status quo where we think we're happy with what we have and we never make any improvements to it. So in a way, it's allowing for these conversations to happen, the challenges to move on and so on. I think what we need to do, I wouldn't want to see it being optional in a way, because, why would you be, learning about religions and you'll be able to say, what, I don't want to know about it. I'll walk away from it. That might be a bit more dodgy grounds. But how we can move forward, for me, it's like, let's listen to young people. So far, all these conversations are happening, where we're talking to teachers, we're talking to parents, we're listening a lot to about, what the media has got to say. Sometimes they're talking on behalf of parents and on behalf of teachers. But where are the young peoples in this? Their voices matter. And that might actually have been one of the weaknesses, I'd say, maybe of the podcast, is we did hear a lot from the journalists themselves, talking to teachers, talking to whistleblowers, talking to people who were in leadership and so on. But what about the young people who were in the schools? How were they affected by what was going on? How were they affected by the Trojan Horse at the time? And how is this still affecting their lives today? And what did they think should have happened differently? And do they have any advice that, we could take and use to make things better? And unfortunately, I'd say in our society, we're still not giving enough credibility to young adults and children's voices. And so we're not asking them questions. And it's a real shame, because I think we're missing out big time here, really.
Parveen, same question to you.
Yeah, I think a really, really interesting question, because actually, going back to the numbers, the fastest growing religious category in Birmingham is those who have no religion. The fastest growing religious category in the whole of the United Kingdom is those who have no religion. So absolutely, this is a really, really important question. Céline, can I just say, actually, this issue of bringing in voices of young people, it's really crucial. It's really critical, because, this is something, we were talking about the religion being taught at them, the kind of policies, the Islamification being imposed upon them, but we didn't hear about their experiences. And actually going back to one of the reports, which was sanctioned by the government, they didn't listen, or they didn't ask to hear the voices of those teachers who were actually implicated in the Trojan Horse Affair either. So I do think there's a number of voices which are marginalized, be it young people, be it those who are accused. And it's very dangerous to have one particular type of rhetoric which is reinforced in different spheres, be it in the media, be it in legislature, be it in policy sphere, which relies very narrowly on very specific voices.
Just before we finish off, Céline, a little bit of I suppose, a prediction for the future. Do you think something like this could happen again? And do you think those learnings that we've sort of been talking about and what can be done to improve will actually come into fruition? Or do you think it will just be one of those things where we're going to be talking about this kind of thing forever?
I think this definitely a space to watch, because we can see that from the teachers community especially, there's a big push to change the way religious education is being taught in state-funded schools. There's a bit of reticence to see that change being implemented. It's mostly trying to capture the voices of lived experiences a lot more and do a lot more justice to the diversity of religious traditions within religious traditions as well. So this is definitely a space to watch, because I think we'll see changes that might be quite slow to happen, because we see that there's reticence at a higher level to implement those changes, because I don't think there's a lot of politicians who want to be known for having changed the way religion happens in education, or even just talk about, if we didn't want to have conversations around an Islamic ethos in schools in the future, then it means you'd probably need to remove the collective act of worship in the schools. And who wants to be known as, the minister that cancelled God in schools, or that kind of thing? So we know what the lines might be in the papers. So whilst this isn't being challenged or changed, yes, and whilst we're still living in a society where Islamophobia is a thing, yes, I'm afraid that, these things could happen again. I'm hoping not, but yes, it could happen again.
Parveen, you've mentioned critical thinking as something that sort of needs to happen. And can you just explain a little bit more about how that would happen, and also if you think it will?
Okay, I think, can I just come back to your point about whether this could happen again? I think there's a legacy, right? And the legacy, the Muslim community in Birmingham and in the UK is still living with that legacy. So I think that this is something which happened in 2014, the letter comes out in 2013, 14, and it's history. But actually, if you ask, just an ordinary person, do you know what the Trojan Affair was about? They'd say, oh, was it when the Muslims tried to take over the schools in Birmingham? Okay, so the intricacies of what eventually happened, the collapse of cases, all of that gets washed out the window, right? It just gets brushed out of the picture. What you have a legacy, and perceptions matter. So even if the letter was a hoax, okay, and that was proved very early on, and yet when legislation was put into place, the education minister at the time, who very well knew that the letter was a hoax, was still quoting the letter and pushing forward this legislation, which is still in place. So when I'm talking about critical thinking, I think it's really important to have all the evidence put forward in the public domain, have different viewpoints, different opinions, and just going back to the point, have different voices in the public domain who can express what their lived experiences, what they feel has happened, as well as the truth and false of whether this letter existed, whether it's true, whether the plot existed, and people can make up their own minds. It seemed, looking back at the affair, that the mind of public officials, policymakers, media elites was already made up, right? That there is this Muslim bid to take over. It's plot, it's sinister, this fifth column, they're within us and they're trying to take over us. It's a very different thing. It's a very different feel from having, there's a few individual teachers who are doing this, and this, and who need disciplined. So, and I think that legacy of this plot, this takeover, this fifth column, it's still very much a part of the lived realities of young people and others in the city.
It's one of those, and it comes back to, it's easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than the speak your weight machine. Just one of those stories that, another saying, which is a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its trousers on, and it seems that the truth has taken quite a long time in this case to catch up with the lie. But look, we thank you both very much. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and something like you say is it's not going to go away anytime soon, but taking the learnings from it is the most important thing. We'll say goodbye for this one. So we'll say goodbye to Céline, Benoit and Parveen, Akhtar, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.